They said she was gone. The machines had gone silent. The priest had spoken his last words, but the golden dog wouldn't move. Not from the coffin. Not from her side. When a forgotten golden retriever named Marlowe climbed atop a little girl's casket and refused to leave, no one expected what would happen next, because what he did would shake a town, silence a doctor, and bring a child back from where no one returns. If you believe in second chances and miracles, or in the quiet power of love, this story is for you. Chapter 1. The Friend from the Frost. Revised. The town of Maple Ridge lay draped in a hush of fresh snow, every rooftop capped in white, the roads still unplowed from last night's blizzard. Smoke rose from chimneys in soft curling tendrils, fading into the pale blue sky. The storm had swept through like an old tired guest, fierce but brief, leaving behind silence the kind that only comes when nature decides to pause. It was late January in New Hampshire, and the world was quiet, almost reverent. Lila Monroe, 7 years old, small for her age with a cascade of copper curls and freckles that spilled across her nose like cinnamon, pressed her face against the frost-bitten window. Her breath fogged the glass and she wiped a small circle clean with her mitten. "Daddy," she said softly, not turning something's moving in the woods. Her father, Grant. Monroe followed her gaze. He was a tall, broad-shouldered man in his early 40s with graying hair at the temples, and eyes the color of worn denim, a former firefighter who now restored antique clocks. Grant carried the quiet heaviness of a man who had once run toward flames, only to be burned in ways no water could cure. Since losing his wife 3 years prior in a house fire, he couldn't stop. Couldn't even reach. His voice had become a softer thing, used more often for murmured encouragements than conversation. "What did you see?" he asked, kneeling beside Lila. His tone was gentle, not because she was fragile, but because life had made her so. "I think it was gold." Lila replied, her voice thoughtful, like a sunbeam, but it was lying down. He squinted out across the snowy field that edged into the woods. There, near a toppled maple tree, something shimmered faintly against the snow, a small huddle of fur, almost buried but not quite still. Grant hesitated. It had been a rough storm. The roads were barely clear, and whatever that shape was, it could be hurt or worse. But Lila tugged at his sleeve, her green eyes wide with that particular kind of knowing only children carry. "Please, Daddy." Jessie bundled in layers. They trudged through the knee-deep snow, Lila holding tight to his gloved hand. The wind had calmed, but the cold clung to them like wet linen. As they neared the edge of the woods, the golden shape became clearer. It was a dog, a golden retriever, maybe 2 or 3 years old. Blood stained its side, matted dark against pale fur, and one of its paws lay at an unnatural angle beneath its body. But it breathed. Barely. Lila fell to her knees beside it. "We have to help him," she whispered. "He's trying so hard." Grant looked down at the injured dog. The eyes that opened to meet his were dull, but aware, filled not with fear but exhaustion. Grant had seen that look before in men pulled from wreckage and fellow firemen after long nights. "I'm not sure he'll make it," Grant said quietly, more to himself than to Lila. "He made it through the storm," she said, "so maybe he just needs someone now." There was no arguing with that. Wrapping the dog gently in his thick fireman's coat, Grant lifted the trembling creature into his arms. It weighed less than it should, its ribs pressed through skin and fur, and when it whimpered it sounded like air through broken glass. Back at their modest farmhouse, Grant laid the dog on a nest of towels by the hearth, where the fire crackled with orange light. Lila fetched a bowl of water and a slice of ham from her sandwich without being asked. The dog didn't eat at first, just watched her with one open eye, his body too tired to react. Grant knelt beside the animal. checking the leg. Fractured. Badly, he murmured, reaching for a splint he'd made long ago in his firefighter days. He worked with a kind of reverence, the way he did when cleaning old gears, as if the dog might fall apart if handled too roughly. Lila sat beside the dog. He needs a name. Grant didn't answer right away. Naming things had weight. It meant hope. It meant permanence. I like Marlowe, Lila said after a moment. It sounds gentle. Grant looked at her. Marlowe. Yeah, like a hero in a story who doesn't talk much but always listens. He nodded slowly. Marlowe it is. That night, as snow began falling again in soft, hushed flurries, Grant peeked into Lila's room. She was asleep, curled beneath her quilt, her helmet placed beside her like a sentinel. Marlowe, he had dragged himself across the floor to be near her, now lay curled at the foot of her bed tail, twitching softly in dreams. Grant watched the pair in silence. Something about the dog's presence unsettled him, not in a fearful way, but in the way something almost sacred might. Marlowe seemed to breathe in rhythm with the room, as if he had always belonged there, waiting for the girl with the cinnamon freckles. In the days that followed, Marlowe began to stir more. His appetite returned cautious but steady. He limped around the living room with determination, dragging the mended leg behind him with a dignified sort of patience. But what Grant noticed most was this. Wherever Lila was, Marlowe was close. Always watching, always listening. Not just loyal, but attuned. The dog didn't bark, he didn't beg for food or paw at doors. He simply stayed near her by the fire while she read beside the table when she colored, or just outside the bathroom door when she sang to herself in the mirror. He's quiet, Lila said one day, sitting on the rug with her new friend's head in her lap. So, are you? Grant replied, watching them from the kitchen. Yeah, but I think he's listening to something most people can't hear. And Grant, without knowing why, believed her. By the second week of February, the snow in Maple Ridge had turned from fairy dust white to something more lived in, graying at the edges, where boots had passed, dented from the drag of sleds and plows. But still, the cold hadn't loosened its grip. Frost clung to every window pane, like breath from the past, and icicles hung like solemn sentries outside every door. Inside the Monroe home, life took on a new rhythm. The warmth of the hearth, the murmur of old clocks from Grant's workshop, and the quiet, deliberate presence of a golden shadow that followed Lila everywhere. Marlowe Grant had noticed the first time it happened, though. At the time, he hadn't known what it meant. It was during a quiet afternoon, the kind where the sun barely made it past the clouds and the wind spoke only in sighs. Lila was coloring at the kitchen table, her little fingers smudging the edges of a picture she said was a castle made of clouds. Marlowe had been lying beside the stove, half asleep. But then he stirred, lifted his head, ears forward, not with a jolt, but with something like intent. He stood, crossed the room, and gently pressed his nose against Lila's knee. She looked at him, puzzled. A few seconds later, her crayon slipped from her hand. Her body stiffened. It was a short seizure. Grant caught her before she hit the ground. When it passed, and Lila lay quietly on the couch with a damp cloth over her forehead, Marlowe curled against her side and refused to move. That night, Grant stood at the kitchen counter pouring coffee he didn't need, staring into the dark. Outside, the dog lay across the threshold of Lila's room, like a guard posted at a palace gate. It wasn't a fluke. Over the next week, it happened again and again. Each time Marlowe knew before anyone else. On the advice of Dr. Marion Layton, Lila's longtime neurologist. A steely woman in her 50s with a spine as straight as her beliefs and a compassion buried under layers of science, Grant began a journal, a little brown notebook he titled Marlowe's Pages, where he logged the dog's behavior, whining before an episode. pressing his head against Lila's legs, sometimes circling her slowly, almost like he was forming a boundary no harm could cross. And each time without fail, Lila would seize within moments. Grant found himself watching Marlowe more than he ever had. It wasn't just loyalty, there was calculation behind those amber eyes, awareness. Not a trained reflex, but something instinctual. Deeper. As if Marlowe were reading invisible signs in the air. "What do you think he sees?" Grant asked Lila one night while brushing her damp hair after her bath. Lila, her face half asleep and glowing under the lamplight, replied, "He hears the whisper." Grant paused, brush mid-stroke. "What whisper?" "The one before it happens. It's quiet, I used to feel it too, but now it hides from me. I think it talks to Marlowe instead." She said it with such simplicity, such trust, that Grant didn't correct her. He didn't laugh, he only nodded. That weekend, Maple Ridge Public Library hosted its monthly story and craft morning. Miss Tilda Evans, retired teacher knitter of loud sweaters and undisputed queen of children's hour, had invited Lila personally. Books and glue sticks, she'd said, laughing over the phone. What more could a child want? It was the first public outing for Marlowe. "Are you sure?" Grant had asked, leash in hand. He might not be ready. Lila had been firm. "He won't leave me." So they went. The library's basement room smelled of paper, washable markers and faint cinnamon. Children clustered around tables folding paper crowns, while parents sipped bad coffee from paper cups. Lila took her place with a small group, quietly tracing stars on her crown, while Marlowe settled beneath the table like a golden rug. He didn't bark, didn't whine. But he watched her. Always. Her. When a balloon popped across the room, he didn't flinch. When another child dropped an entire container of glitter, Marlowe barely shifted. But the moment Lila touched her forehead and looked faint, Marlowe stood up and pressed his head to her chest. Grant was by her side within seconds, but nothing followed. No seizure, just stillness. Later at home, Lila whispered as Grant tucked her in. He knew it wouldn't happen. That's why he stayed quiet. Grant opened Marlowe's pages again that night. Feb 18. Marlowe reacted to Lila's discomfort at the library. No episode followed, but he stood anyway. Like he was saying, "I see it too." The air in Maple Ridge had taken on the stillness that comes before a season shifts. Snow still lingered in shaded corners, but the wind no longer carried the bite of midwinter. Instead, it whispered of thaw. Beneath the earth, things were waking up. And inside the Monroe house, something else was beginning to stir possibility. It started on a Thursday morning when the police came to the library. Lila and Marlowe had become something of a fixture at Miss Tilda Evans' reading circle. The retired teacher, with her rosy cheeks and shawls knitted in chaotic colors, welcomed them with open arms. Marlowe would lie quietly near the circle, his head between his paws, while Lila read aloud from books she could barely carry. That morning, Chief Nolan Bennett had come to deliver new fire safety pamphlets for the library. A lifelong resident of Maple Ridge, Bennett was a tall man in his 50s with a slow, steady gait and a beard like salt-dusted coal. People described him as unflappable, the kind of man who could diffuse a bar brawl with a raised eyebrow or calm a panicked parent with a hand on the shoulder. He had never expected to be moved by a dog. But when he entered the children's room and saw the golden retriever sitting upright beside a little girl, not barking, not fidgeting, just watching her with the quiet intensity of a sentinel, he stopped. Miss Tilda noticed. "That's Marlowe," she said with a smile. "Rescue dog. Lives with Lila Monroe and her father. Sweetest creature I've ever seen. But it's more than that. He knows things." Chief Bennett raised an eyebrow. "Knows things she's epileptic," she said quietly. "That dog senses it before it happens." Happens every time. Later that day, Chief Bennett called Grant. "I've got a strange proposition," he said, leaning back in his chair at the police station papers spread before him. "We're partnering with a regional program, Canine Rescue Medical Division. They train dogs like Marlowe dogs with that sixth sense." Grant, listening on the other end, was skeptical. "He's not a tool," he said plainly. "He's part of our family. I know that the chief said this wouldn't take him away. It's a part-time role. One trainer, a few sessions a week, he'd still be Lila's dog. Always." Grant didn't answer immediately. His eyes were on Marlowe, who lay beside Lila as she painted stars on construction paper, utterly calm. "Come by the station," Chief Bennett said. "Bring him. No pressure, just meet the trainer." The next day they went. The Maple Ridge Police Department was small, a brick building with blue trim and an American flag that snapped lightly in the breeze. Inside they were greeted by Officer James Lowry, the head of K-9 training for the region. Lowry was a compact man in his 40s with cropped brown hair and the kind of posture that came from years of military habit. His handshake was firm, his eyes focused, but there was something warm beneath the surface, a quiet reverence for the animals he worked with. "Marlowe," he said, crouching beside the dog, "let's see what you've got." What followed was unexpected. Without commands, Marlowe responded to Lila's subtle shifts. When she stood, he moved with her. When she hesitated mid-step, he placed himself beside her knee. When she frowned, he nudged her hand-tail low and still. Lowry observed it all in silence. "This dog's not trained," he said, finally looking up, "but he's working. He's already alerting." "What does that mean?" Grant asked. "It means he doesn't need to be taught what to do." Lowry replied, "He needs to be supported, doing what he already knows. With guidance, he could help more than just your daughter." Grant's jaw tightened slightly. "And what does my daughter do if he's not with her during a seizure?" Lowry nodded slowly. "That's the part we work out together." Meanwhile, another kind of attention had begun to gather around Marlowe. At the back of the room stood June Whitaker, local reporter for the Maple Ridge Chronicle. She had stopped by the station that morning for an unrelated interview, but paused when she saw the golden retriever. June was in her early 30s, sharp-eyed with a constantly ink-stained wrist, and hair always pulled up in a messy twist. She rarely wrote about pets unless there was more to the story. After the demonstration, she approached Grant in the hallway. "I'd like to write about him," she said. "Not a puff piece, a real one. About instinct, about this town finding hope in a dog." Grant looked at her cautiously. "Why?" "Because I've been watching," she replied. "And I don't think it's just about him saving a child. I think something's shifting in this town, and he's at the center." Grant didn't say yes, but he didn't say no. What he didn't know, what no one in the station knew, was that later that night, June began digging deeper, not just into Marlowe, but into Maple Ridge General Hospital. She had noticed something odd in the story Grant told during their hallway conversation. The neurologist's diagnosis timeline didn't quite match the medical response time, and the more she looked, the more she found complaints filed and buried. Staff turnover, one doctor in particular, whose name appeared often. Dr. Edward Parsons, head of pediatrics, who'd also signed off on several controversial dismissals. That night, June scribbled 3 words in her notebook: "Follow the dog." Back at home, Grant sat by the fire reading Marlowe's pages. Lila slept on the couch, Marlowe's head resting lightly on her chest, rising and falling with each breath like a metronome. He remembered Lowry's words, "This dog is already working." Grant closed the notebook, glanced at the dog, and whispered, "Maybe it's time we helped him do it right." Maple Ridge had never been known for grandeur. Its streets were narrow, its houses humble, and its events modest. But once a year the town came alive for the community lantern night, a quiet celebration of togetherness, healing, and remembrance. Held in the town square beneath rows of bare maple trees, the event drew nearly every resident wrapped in scarves and carrying lanterns lit with tiny flickering candles. This year, the event fell on a Saturday evening in March. Snow still dusted the sidewalks, though the air smelled faintly of thaw, and pine strings of paper stars swayed above the square, strung from lamp-post to lamp-post, while children drank hot cider from paper cups, and local musicians played acoustic lullabies near the gazebo. Grant Monroe stood near the edge of the square, one hand resting on Marlowe's leash, the other stuffed into the pocket of his wool coat. Lila sat beside him on a folding chair, cheeks rosy from the cold, wearing a blue knit cap and mittens Miss Tilda had made for her. Her eyes, as always, wandered skyward, tracing the invisible stars behind the gray night. Marlowe sat alert at her feet, his gaze sweeping the crowd ears, flicking every few seconds. He had always been calm in crowds, but tonight his body was tight like a coiled spring. Grant noticed it first. A subtle whine, then a glance at Lila. Then stillness. "Hey, Grant," said kneeling down. "You okay, buddy?" Marlowe didn't react. He was focused entirely on Lila. Then came the shift barely perceptible. Lila's expression tightened. Her shoulders trembled. Lila Grant asked. And then she fell. Her body stiffened in the chair, her mittens slipping from her hands. A gasp rippled through the crowd. Grant caught her just as she slid sideways. Marlowe barked just once, loud and clear, a sharp note that echoed through the square. People turned. Music stopped. Someone shouted for a medic. Miss Tilda, who'd been helping at the cocoa stand, came running apron, flapping. "Grant." "She's seizing," Grant said, holding Lila gently on the ground, his voice firm but low. "I've got her." Marlowe lay down beside her, positioning himself with practiced precision along her side, his head beneath her arm to prevent impact. This wasn't panic. This was procedure. The seizure lasted longer than usual, over a minute and a half, and left Lila pale, unconscious, and trembling. But when she came to her first word was a whisper. "Marlowe?" By then, a crowd had gathered, the sheriff, the local pastor families clutching lanterns. Some had tears in their eyes. Others just stared. Chief Bennett stepped forward and knelt beside Grant. "You said the dog warned you." "Almost 2 minutes before." Grant said, sat up, whined, focused. It was exact. Bennett looked around the square. "I think the whole town just saw it too." That night changed everything. Back home, after Lila had been safely tucked in, and the fire burned low, Grant sat at the kitchen table with Marlowe's pages open. He recorded every second of the evening with shaking hands. March 9th, lantern night. Marlowe alert at 6:58, seizure at 7, 0, duration 1 min 45 sec. Entire town witnessed Marlowe's precision, unmistakable. Not coincidence, never was. He looked at Marlowe curled in front of the fireplace, still watchful, even as Lila slept. "You were made for this," Grant murmured. "And maybe we were made to find you." Meanwhile, across town, June. Whitaker sat in her cramped office above the Chronicle's press room, surrounded by stacks of paper old medical board minutes and a worn laptop blinking back at her. She had been digging into the hospital records for 2 weeks now, cross-referencing treatment timelines, misdiagnosed cases, and patient complaint forms. One name kept resurfacing: Dr. Edward Peterson, former director of pediatrics at Maple Ridge General. His name had been removed from the current directory, but his signature appeared on half a dozen cases that raised red flags. Cases like Lila's tonight. She found something new. A name in a 2017 complaint letter. Caroline Mills, a registered nurse who had once worked in pediatric neurology. She had submitted a formal report detailing improper discharges, misdiagnosis, and pressure to downplay symptoms in low-income patients. The complaint was marked resolved. Internal reassignment, but Caroline Mills had disappeared from the state registry the following year. With trembling fingers, June opened a new tab and began searching licensing databases. 10 minutes later, she found it. Caroline J. Mills, now working at a small clinic in rural Oregon. She stared at the screen, heart pounding. Then she picked up the phone. "Val, get me an early column slot for Sunday," she told her editor, "and clear room for a full-length investigative piece. We've got something." The next morning, the town buzzed. Neighbors brought casseroles. Pastor Ray from the local chapel stopped by with hand-knit prayer shawls, and strangers sent messages through the Chronicle's online forum, asking about Marlowe, about Lila, about the dog who had done what machines could not. Grant, overwhelmed, answered none of them. But when Officer Lowry came to the door that afternoon, wearing his Navy K-9 division jacket and holding a packet of paperwork, Grant let him in. "We're ready," he said. Marlowe trotted forward, tail low, eyes bright as if he already knew the next chapter was beginning. The storm rolled in without warning, as if the sky had grown tired of holding itself together. By the time the ambulance reached Maple Ridge General Hospital, sleet had begun to whip sideways, slashing against the windshield like it meant to carve open the night. Inside the vehicle, Grant sat rigid, one hand wrapped tightly around Lila's limp fingers, the other clenched on Marlowe's collar Lila had seized before. Many times, but never like this. This one hadn't stopped. Not in 2 minutes. Not in 10. Not even after the rescue medication. It had been 27 minutes and counting. Beside her, Marlowe pressed close, whining in low rhythmic tones, his nose brushing her cheek with each breath, as though willing her to respond. The EMTs had made space for him, seeing what others had already come to accept. This dog wasn't a bystander. He was part of the emergency response. They arrived at Maple Ridge General through a haze of red lights and sirens. The ER doors burst open. Doctors swarmed. Lila was wheeled away, Grant running beside the gurney. Marlowe tried to follow but was stopped by a stern voice. "Animal stays here." Grant turned to see a tall man in a white coat, silver-haired, cold-eyed clipboard in hand. Dr. Edward Peterson. The name hit him like ice down the spine. He was the one June had mentioned, the one with the history, the one who had signed off on half the reports that never made sense. Grant opened his mouth to protest, but Marlowe growled low. Just once. Peterson's lip curled. "This isn't a kennel. Take that mutt outside. He's not just a dog. Grant said he's her medical alert, and I'm the attending physician." Peterson snapped out. The doors shut between them. It felt like being shoved into a void. 30 minutes later, Dr. Peterson returned. "She's unresponsive," he said. Voice dry as dust. No reflexes, no pupillary reaction. EEG shows no cortical activity. "I'm sorry, Mr. Monroe. Your daughter's condition is irreversible. We'll arrange for next steps with the coroner." Grant stood frozen. "What are you saying?" "I'm saying she's gone, but something in Grant's chest rebelled. Rage didn't come. Not yet, only silence. Deep, terrible silence." He sat down, numb, unable to weep, and Marlowe. Marlowe whimpered once, then turned and bolted. The dog ran out of the ER through the automatic doors, past a security guard who barely had time to shout, into the icy night. 3 days later, the funeral was held. The casket was small, white closed. It sat at the front of the church beneath a wooden cross wrapped in early spring lilies. The town had gathered in quiet sorrow. Pastor Ray led the service, voice trembling at times as he recited the Psalms. Grant sat in the front pew alone, a widower burying a child. No Marlowe. No noise, only the sounds of breath and grief. But as the service ended and people began to rise, a stir rippled at the back of the sanctuary, Marlowe coated in frost and mud, panting eyes wild with sorrow and defiance. He had been missing for 72 hours, and now he was here. He walked past the pews, ignoring the outstretched hands, past the altar, past the pulpit, and stopped in front of the casket. He whined once, then placed his front paws on the edge. Grant moved to pull him back but froze. Marlowe wasn't howling, wasn't circling in confusion. He was alerting head-low tail, still eyes fixed, that same low-pulsing whine, the same sound he made before every seizure. And then he barked, once sharp, desperate. Grant's breath caught. "No," he whispered. "Not now, buddy. Don't do this to me." But Marlowe didn't move, didn't stop. He was trying to say something, trying to warn someone. That night, Grant sat in his dark kitchen with the casket delivery paperwork on the table. His hands shook. "She's not gone," he whispered to no one. "You don't do this unless she's not gone." He grabbed Marlowe's pages, flipped to the back. March 13, post-hospital. Marlowe ran, returned at a funeral. Alerted, whine, bark. Same sequence. No seizure in sight, but alert matched every prior incident. Exact. He stared at the notebook, then at Marlowe, who now lay at the door to Lila's empty room, unmoving, still alert, still waiting. And suddenly the silence didn't feel like mourning anymore. It felt like refusal. The sanctuary of Maple Ridge Church had fallen under a hush so complete it felt sacred. Not the quiet of prayer, but the kind that came with the presence of something larger, something that dared to push against the walls of belief and custom. At the front of the room, Marlowe stood upright with his golden forepaws resting on the white casket's edge, his eyes locked onto its still surface. His body was tense, not in grief, but in focus. From deep within his chest came a low, rhythmic whine, rising slowly in intensity. Then, without warning, he barked. Once, loud and sharp, the kind of bark he had used only in the most urgent moments. Grant Monroe flinched as if struck. His breath caught. The world shifted. In the second row, June. Whitaker stood abruptly, her coat rustling like dried leaves. "That's his alert signal," she said, eyes wide. "The critical one. He's not mourning, he's warning." Ellis Hammond, the funeral director, stepped forward, his face pale. "Please, miss, this is highly irregular. The service is nearly over. We need to open the casket." June interrupted. Grant didn't wait for permission. His voice was quiet, firm. "Do it." Ellis looked from one face to another. The police chief, the pastor, the townspeople whose eyes now brimmed with something dangerously close to hope. This is against procedure." Ellis stammered. "She was declared. She's still warm." Grant said suddenly, his voice shaking, "I felt her. The night before. She wasn't cold. I thought I was going mad." But he knew Chief Nolan Bennett stepped forward. His expression, usually unreadable now, carried the weight of a man ready to gamble his name for something unseen. "We'll take responsibility," the chief said. "Open it." And Ellis, trembling, nodded. The latch gave way with a soft click, a sound that rang like a thunderclap in the silent sanctuary. Officer Lowry helped carefully lift the lid. Gasps echoed inside. Lila lay just as she had when they last saw her, dressed in the pale blue dress with stars at the collar, hands folded, hair neatly braided. Her face looked untouched by death. No stiffness, no unnatural stillness. "She's June," whispered. "She doesn't look." Bennett stepped forward, fingers seeking a pulse at her neck. His hand froze. Then his eyes went wide. "She's alive," he said, barely audible. The room erupted. "Pulse is faint, but it's there," he added. now shouting over the wave of disbelief and rising motion. "Call an ambulance," someone yelled. June was already dialing. "Dispatch, this is June. Whitaker, get EMS to Maple Ridge Church. Immediate life sign and a declared fatality. Child breathing. Barely, but she's alive." Grant stumbled back as tears streamed down his face. His hands clutched the edge of the pew. He didn't fall, but he bent as if the air had been knocked from his lungs. Pastor Ray dropped to his knees, whispering prayers he didn't know. He remembered. Others wept openly. Marlowe stepped back from the casket and sat on his haunches, quiet now. Still, his message had been delivered. By the time paramedics arrived, the sanctuary had transformed into a solemn stage of disbelief and action. The medics moved swiftly, checking vitals, securing an airway, beginning stabilization measures. One of them, a young red-headed woman named Cassidy Lane, looked stunned as her hands moved with professional certainty. "Vitals are faint, but present." She confirmed. "BP low, pulse irregular. But it's real. She's not responding," her partner said. "But her pupils are reactive." Cassidy looked at Grant. "She needs to get to the ER. Now she's going to be okay?" Grant asked, voice barely human. Cassidy didn't answer because she didn't know. They lifted Lila onto the stretcher, her body limp but not lifeless. As they wheeled her down the aisle, people parted in silence. Marlowe followed until the threshold, then stopped. He sat again, watching her disappear into flashing red lights. Only when the ambulance doors closed did he look back at Grant, and Grant knew this wasn't over. But the story had not ended the way they feared. The snow had melted in Maple Ridge, but Boston still held on to winter. The city's skyline rose in jagged lines of steel and glass, a world away from the sleepy trees and wooden porches of home. Yet, in a bright room on the 11th floor of Children's Neurology Center, the only thing that mattered was a small girl in a hospital bed, her fingers twitching faintly beneath warm blankets, and a golden retriever who refused to leave her side. Lila had been airlifted the night after the funeral. That wasn't. Her pulse had stabilized in the ambulance, but she had not regained consciousness. The doctors in Boston were cautious with their words: postictal, state, neurological suppression, possible cataleptic recovery, but no one dared say the word miracle. Not yet. Grant slept in a reclining chair pulled beside her bed, his hand never far from hers, and Marlowe ever still lay like a sentinel near her feet. Even in this unfamiliar place, with machines humming and strangers in white coats moving like ghosts, he was unmoving alert. It was the fourth morning when it happened. A nurse named Holly Medina, a petite woman in her late 30s with auburn curls and an ex-gymnast's posture, entered the room during shift change. She was known on the floor for being kind but efficient. Her humor dry, her tolerance for arrogance minimal. She paused at the doorway, watching as Marlowe sat up, eyes locked on Lila. Then the whine. Then the pacing. "Sir," she said, stepping toward Grant. "Something's about to happen." Grant blinked awake. "You heard him." "I've seen enough seizure warnings to trust that look." Holly said, "Let's get the crash meds ready." 90 seconds later, Lila's body began to seize. It was not violent, not prolonged, but enough. And Marlowe had known again. By noon, the doctors were calling it pre-ictal awareness, but Holly had a different name. "That dog," she said, smiling at Marlowe, "is the best nurse on the floor." Back in Maple Ridge, June, Whitaker stood on the steps of the local courthouse, facing a wall of microphones. She had not planned to become a national voice, but when she published her investigative piece, The Death, they nearly buried, it took less than 48 hours for the world to notice. Her article recounted the sequence of events from Marlowe's alert to the opening of Lila's casket to the ambulance ride, and the subsequent backlash against Dr. Edward Peterson. Included were interviews with families, former staff members, and finally a leaked copy of an internal memo that confirmed prior complaints had been dismissed by administration without proper review. June's voice was calm as she read her statement. This isn't just about one girl. It's about a system that forgot how to listen. A system that silenced whistleblowers and dismissed intuition. It took a dog to break through that silence and a child to remind us what was at stake. By that evening, Dr. Peterson had been suspended pending full investigation. 2 days later, he resigned. Meanwhile, Lila was improving. On the 6th day in Boston, she opened her eyes. They were unfocused at first, blinking against the fluorescent light. But when she turned her head and saw Marlowe, a smile curled her lips. "Good boy," she whispered. It took another week before she could sit up and 3 more before she could walk down the hallway without assistance. But she did one step at a time, and always with Marlowe beside her. Doctors called it unprecedented, neurologically significant, and clinically rare. But Grant only called it one thing. Faith, he told a nurse, and a dog that never gave up. In mid-April, they returned to Maple Ridge. The town welcomed them like returning heroes. The Chronicle published a special issue titled "The Girl Who Came Back and the Dog Who Wouldn't Leave." And 1 week later, the family received an invitation. "You are cordially invited to the National Service Animal Awards ceremony held in New York City. Marlowe Monroe has been selected as the recipient of the 2025 Outstanding Medical Alert Dog of the Year." Grant laughed when he read it. He doesn't care about awards. But when they stood under the television lights and the host recounted Marlowe's journey, his rescue, his devotion, his refusal to accept death, the entire room stood and applauded. Lila, dressed in a blue dress with stars on the collar, clutched Marlowe's leash and whispered, "They all know now." A silver medallion was placed around Marlowe's neck. He didn't flinch. He only looked up at Lila and wagged his tail. 6 months had passed since the day Marlowe barked beside a white casket and rewrote the fate of a family. Now, Maple Ridge wore its winter coat again. Snow dusted the picket fences and rooftops, frosting pine trees with a soft shimmer. Children built crooked snowmen near the library, and shopkeepers hung lights across shuttered windows, braving the early dusk with mugs of cinnamon coffee, and stories they still whispered in disbelief. The girl they almost buried, the dog who wouldn't let her go. Lila Monroe was sitting upright in her wheelchair on the back deck of her house, wrapped in a navy blue blanket and a woolen hat stitched with tiny stars. Her cheeks were full again, her eyes bright. The pale girl who once hovered on the edge of silence now spoke in careful, simple sentences, words that carried weight because they had returned from such darkness. Beside her sat Marlowe Tail, flicking lightly, head resting on her lap. "You're warm," Lila said slowly, petting his fur, "like sun, like home." She still had trouble with long thoughts, but her heart made up the difference, and Marlowe always listened like he understood every word. From the kitchen window, Grant watched them. His face was older now, lined not by age, but by what they had survived. Yet his shoulders were no longer weighed down. He poured 2 mugs of cocoa and handed one to Sarah DeWitt, the program director of Marlowe's Voice. Sarah, in her early 40s, was a slender woman with short cropped hair and kind hazel eyes that missed nothing. A former Army medic turned animal behaviorist, she had a quiet intensity that made people and dogs listen when she spoke. She had come into their lives after the National Awards show offering more than just praise. She brought a plan. "We take dogs like Marlowe." She had said the forgotten ones, the ones people gave up on. "And we teach them to save lives just like he did." Now, 6 months later, Marlowe's Voice was a registered nonprofit, operating from a renovated barn just outside Maple Ridge. The first class included 6 rescued dogs, each one with a story no less broken than Marlowe's had been, and waiting lists for partnerships stretched across 3 states, Lila was the honorary ambassador. Her smile paired with Marlowe's golden eyes had become the emblem on every brochure. That afternoon a light snow began to fall. Tiny flakes danced in the air like fragments of blessing. Lila giggled as they landed on her eyelashes. Grant wheeled her carefully across the deck and down the gentle ramp toward the yard. "Just 5 minutes," he said. "We'll come in if it gets colder." Marlowe padded beside them, ears alert, but relaxed his body, moving with a quiet grace that still amazed the doctors. They reached the open lawn, still pristine with untouched snow. Then Marlowe paused. He looked back at Lila. His ears perked, and then slowly, deliberately, he began to walk in a wide circle around her chair. One loop, then another and another. When he was finished, he sat, his tail swept the snow once. Then he looked up at Grant. Lila, blinking, looked down and gasped. "He made a heart," she whispered. "Daddy, he made a heart." It was not perfect, but in the fresh snow, the trail of Marlowe's paws traced the shape clearly, an uneven, loving heart wrapped around Lila's wheelchair. A heart pressed into the cold by 4 determined feet. Grant couldn't speak. He knelt down beside his daughter and the dog who had brought her back. From the porch, Sarah snapped a photo with her phone. That image, the girl in blue, the golden dog, and the heart-shaped path would go on to grace the front page of Time, be printed on murals in hospitals and hang in classrooms across the country. But in that moment it was just for them, just a quiet miracle in a backyard touched by snow. Later that evening, as the first fire of the season crackled in the hearth, Sarah looked up from her laptop. "We just got confirmation," she said. 2 more hospitals want to partner with Marlowe's Voice, and the Department of Veterans Affairs is asking if we can expand to PTSD support. Grant exhaled slowly. That dog saved more than Lila. He changed the way people think about what's possible. Sarah said, "That kind of love, it doesn't happen twice." At that moment, Lila's voice came from the hallway. "Marlowe, come sleep by me." Grant and Sarah watched as the golden retriever rose, stretched once, and padded down the hall without hesitation. His tail swayed steady as a metronome. In a world still full of uncertainty, Marlowe was the constant, the heartbeat that never faltered. In the dim warmth of the house, Grant turned to Sarah and said softly, "He never gave up." Sarah nodded, and neither did she. Outside, the heart in the snow slowly faded under new snowfall, but the imprint remained beneath the surface where warmth had once touched cold, where love had left a mark no storm could ever erase. Sometimes miracles do not roar in thunder or blaze through burning skies. Sometimes they arrive on 4 quiet paws with a heartbeat that refuses to give up. In a world that often forgets to look twice, God reminds us through the humble, the small, and the overlooked, that love is the loudest voice of all. Lila's story is not just about healing from illness. It is about faith that keeps breathing, even when the world says stop. It is about a dog who saw what others missed, and a father who dared to hope when hope was almost gone. We are all walking through storms, but perhaps today is the day we learn to listen again to what cannot be measured, only felt, to the gentle nudge of grace, to the quiet miracles that still walk among us, often in fur and silence. If this story touched your heart, share it with someone who needs a reminder that they are not forgotten. Subscribe to this channel to hear more stories where love and faith overcome the impossible. Comment below if you believe in miracles. Type Amen if your heart believes that God's plans are greater than our fears, and may the Lord bless you and those you love. May He send a Marlowe into your life just when you need one most.